We didn't think we'd spend 15 days in the same field outside Caen, with the wood behind us and the Germans in another wood half a mile in front of us, and a little empty valley in between. Each side mortaring each other all the time. Just meant you had to live in a slit trench, and you got into a routine. You know, stand true from 4:30 to 5:30, then 2 hours wait for breakfast. Came up fairly hot. Tinned bacon or sausage, tea, and of course biscuits. We've been living on compo food since D-Day. It was good food, but, well, you know, you got tired of it. I'd have given a lot for a slice of fresh bread and butter or a cup of fresh tea. 15 days is a long time to stay in one place and be mortared. You get so you think everyone's coming straight for you.
I can remember every case we ever had, especially the first one. The ambulance brought him in late one afternoon. I came over to where he was lying, and he looked up and grinned. I asked him how he felt. He said something about the German with a machine pistol using him for a dartboard. He was quiet and patient and a little bewildered. He'd never been hurt before. He asked how the fighting was going, then he passed out. The doctor came over and looked at his wounds and then swore. Said he had no business to be alive. We put him on the operating table and did what we could. The doctor kept swearing all the time he was operating. We couldn't stop the bleeding. I remember the radio news that night. They said the casualties had been surprisingly light.
They said the whole thing was dear old Winston's idea. A collapsible prefabricated harbour with everything on it except a naffy. Well, I wouldn't put it past him. It's the sort of idea he would have. It worked in the end. Mulberry, they called it. Well, I felt pretty good about it because I'd watched it grow right from the sinking of the first ships for the outer breakwater. And further along to the west, the Yanks had brought one over too. Then on D+13, I think it was, an onshore wind started up. Not much at first, but it got worse. And unloading onto the open beaches got very tricky. We heard that over on the Yank section, the other harbour had been put right out of action. And when the wind dropped, old Mulberry looked pretty sick. And up to that time, it was the only bleeding harbour we had.
At the green tip of Normandy, the town of Cherbourg lay, a harbour for supplies. Our need for ports was vital as our breath. The German knew our lack and swiftly drew his forces into tight defensive groups so to contest the issue. All our plans turned upon Cherbourg. All our strategy waited upon its empty docks and piers. So the Americans, sent all across Normandy to the coast, swung toward the north, impatient for the port. Through hedge and field, they carved their heavy way.
You remember back now when it seems like we took Cherbourg a couple of days after we hit the beach. Actually, it took 19 days to cover 30 miles. 30 miles and about 92,000 hedgerows, and a battle at every hedgerow. Otherwise, it was nice country, like Connecticut. Pretty trees and orchards, lots of cows, and nice little farmhouses. The apples were too green to eat, I remember. We hit it all fine with the people. Farmers, nice people. It got tough when we pulled up on the outskirts of Cherbourg. They had great defenses. Then the artillery really carried the ball. For 3 days, we sucked it to them. Sometimes we were pouring in at point-blank range over open sights. Finally, old von Schlieben, the German commander, tossed in the sponge. That's after telling his men to fight to the death. We took Cherbourg on June 25th. Everything was rosy except the harbor we come from. The Jerrys had really smeared that harbor. But right away, our guys went to work cleaning it up. And the way they tore into it, you could see that pretty soon it'd be waiting for us fine. Then, well, we fought our way up the peninsula. Now we'd have to fight our way out of it.
And everywhere inside France, we men of the Maquis were fighting too. I was in the north myself. We cut telephone and telegraph and high-tension lines, and eventually, when the Allies landed, we fought in the open. In the Savoy Mountains, our friends held up German convoys. Well, it was a little easier in the mountains. Boche reinforcements were delayed for many days. Factories and bridges would frequently disappear. But the price we paid for it was frightful. In the village of Oradour alone, the Germans slaughtered 1,100 out of the 1,200 population, and the place was completely burned. They were accused to have ambushed German troops. Every house was destroyed. Women and children died in flames in the church where they had been locked. Yes, the price we paid was very great, but our job was done.
Caen is a town through which the easy Orne ripples its slow way to the waiting sea, capital of Normandy. And here the British struck a stone wall of Germans. This was no Cherbourg advance, a knife thrust through the fields, but rather was the grinding of a drill, inch by inch forward. Here it was the German feared a quick breakthrough to the River Seine, and here it was he massed his army's best, 10 of the 12 divisions of his armor, paratroops, SS men, the young, the cruel, against the veterans of Alamein. We wanted him to fight here and to hold the battered ground because the future plans depended on him standing where he was. At Caen, the dust was diamonds. Every foot of ground was priceless, for by mid-most summer, Caen was to be the pivot of the war.
The first decent-sized town we had taken, but there wasn't any celebrations because we knew nothing had been settled. Jerry was as strong as ever. One of the men said, "God, are we going to have to go right across the world doing this to beat them?" Because most of Caen was dust, just plain dust. I wondered what Hamilton back home in Canada would look like after a beating like that. Well, anyway, our tanks and the British started massing and moved south out of the city. We knew there was a big do coming up.
The show for us began south of Caen, where the Poles joined up with us. When we began moving forward, I heard a lot of the lads say Rommel's on the run. But I'd been at Alamein, I knew he wasn't on the run. And I was right. There was nothing lovely about the battle south of Caen. No pincer movements, no outflanking, no nothing like that. Just an hard, bitter, bloody slogging match. We had to stay there and give as good as we got, even if we couldn't give better.
Beyond the rubble and the dust of Caen, the Empire troops kept up their endless pressure. The German did not dare to disengage, but fought with all his cunning and his strength, still unaware of what we planned for him. West by St. Lo, the base of his defense, Americans were poised and bent to fire an armored arrow that would set alight the flame of freedom through the whole of France. But till Saint-Lô was seized, the arrow waited.
One minute it's quiet with the birds singing. The next minute the column of Sherman tanks coming around the corner going wide open. My buddy says, where those tanks come from? So I ask the tanker. He yells down there the Third Army taking off. Been waiting for 3 weeks. Prepared somebody let the rabbit out of the hat. Man, what a rabbit. With pearl-handled revolvers.
When I think back to the breakthrough, I don't seem to be able to remember anything but the French people. People beside the road, kids we couldn't stop to give candy to, FFI boys bringing in the krauts from the fields, and farm workers waving as we went by. It was easier to look them in the face and smile and wave back at them when you hadn't had to smash their homes to pieces first. The morning we got into Rennes, boy, that really was liberation.
At Rennes, American armor planned to drive east and northeast, and thus surround and take the German Caen divisions in the rear. The foe laid plans to stop the arrow dead by cutting its supply route at the point where it stretched narrowest along the coast. So a great force exploded toward Mortain, hoping at Avranches to achieve the sea and drag our hopes down to the smoking ground.
There's a lot of places I'd rather talk about than Mortain. That's where I got hit. We've been going great up to there. Some of the guys had even been singing, harmonizing. And then that first German artillery caught us. Pretty accurate, too. An hour later, I was short 18 men. Well, we holed in and we hit back with everything we had. They weren't just trying to stop us, see? They want to come right through. And then me. I get a belt in the face left side and I keeled. The last thing I remember is looking up and seeing those RAF Typhoons. When I heard them screaming up ahead, I thought, geez, I'm glad they're on our side.
I was sitting in front of the intelligence office doing a bit of sunbathing when headquarters came through saying the area northwest of Mortain was packed with German armor heading west. Well, that started it. For 6 hours, the wind kept it up absolutely non-stop. Take off, attack, land, refuel, rearm, and take off again. It was the same on every airfield in Normandy. The only briefing I gave the chaps was, well, you know where they are. And the only interrogation when they got back was, well, how many did you get?
3 days it lasted. Every kind of soldier was in there and every weapon. For me, it was just eating and smoking and loading at 105. No sleeping. Then things quieted down and the word came back. We stopped them cold. Everybody felt like celebrating, but that was a tough order out there. I tried drinking a whole bottle of cough medicine. It worked fine. I got stiffer than a plank.
The counterattack, which took us by surprise, still did not hinder our deceptive plans, for down from Caen the foe had drawn a force and left his north flank weakened. Now the stage was set. Toward Calais swept the Empire troops together with the Poles. The German heard behind his back American armor churn toward Argenton. Out-generaled and out-fought, he found himself within a closing trap.
I've covered them with the gun down to the clearing stations. Thousands of them, and all kinds. The tough ones with the smile froze stiff on their faces by shell fire. And the plain Joes that had too much and ready to tell you that. And their poker-faced officers that never lost the poker-faced look. The SS, the parachute troops, the old soldiers off the Russian front, I've seen them all. The Hitler youth babies looking like they walked out of Lincoln High. Expert killers. Smart Alec with their talk of rights under the Geneva Convention and asking, when do we go to America? And the other guy who crawled out of a hole with his hands up, all through and talking too much, ready to swear he hated Hitler all the time. The kids that knew how a machine gun worked and nothing else. Grinning like they were still on top, so we could hardly hold that trigger finger still. And middle-aged guys wanting to tell you about the wife and kids, if you'd let them. And they were through killing when I saw them, and through getting killed, too. Some of them thought they were lucky, and others didn't. And some didn't give a... I covered them down to the rear where it was somebody's job to find out what made them tick, but it wasn't my job to figure them out. I just kept them covered. And brother, I never gave them more than the Geneva Convention. And that was all.
American tanks ground on into the east toward Paris and the Upper Seine. Before them, the Germans helter-skelter fled away and saw retreat or stood with hands upraised by roads all littered with their smoldering gear. And Still the tanks ground on beyond the smoke into the unscarred country.
A good solid map, well delineated, is an absolute must for a modern mechanized army traveling at high speed. In our division, the issuing of maps was my job. When we broke out of the Cherbourg Peninsula, my department had the situation well in hand. Then for us, everything went mad, stark, raving mad. One morning I woke up and the army had gone right off the map, absolutely right off the map. So we rushed through an order for 500,000 maps of the Orléans region. They arrived in due time. To our horror, the army progressed far beyond the Orléans region. It was off the map again. This was a period of acute crisis for me. I gave the highest priority to a fresh order of maps of the Paris area. We refused to be licked by this situation. The final blow came when it became evident that we were going to bypass Paris. That almost finished us. Eventually, we had to drop 10 tons of maps to them by parachute. It was a very humiliating experience. I'll be glad when I get back to the Library of Congress where maps have some permanent value.
While the Allies were fighting near Paris, we French soldiers of the Leclerc Division were fighting in the Normandy fields. And suddenly an order came. Go to Paris, it said, and take it. The Allies, after having equipped our division with tanks, guns, rifles, lorries, and jeeps, that night decided to give us Paris too. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, the division starts rushing on the roads, and in the sky, on the right, on the left, everywhere, the American Air Force protects our trip. What a trip. 250 kilometers in one day. I think I'll tell it all the time to my grandchildren and bore them with it until I die.
At the beginning of August, we in Paris were seized by rumors. What could be confirmed was towards the middle of the month, the Germans started to leave the city. Yes, those were the same Germans who had signed 25-year leases on their apartments. Then, on the 14th, our police went on strike. The next day, the Gestapo left. That was the day, too, when a police car opened fire on a German detachment on the Place de la Concorde and began the battle for the city. After that, it seemed the French flag was hanging from every window. All the flags were made of curtains, all dresses, rags, everything, it didn't matter. 4 days later, we heard shouting coming from the Hotel de Ville. We started running. Me, my husband, everyone in our house. As we ran, people were screaming. The French army had arrived. When we got to the Place de l'Hotel de Ville, we saw it was true. I kissed my husband because he was crying. Oh, it's funny, eh? We began to realize how unhappy we had been for 4 years and how lucky we were to be alive on this August evening.
The great pursuit was on. At last the Battle of France was ending, when all suddenly another D-Day stunned the shaken foe. 2 armies struck, American and French, along the broad-beached southern coast of France. Then north, the 2 new armies rolled like waves to join the forces moving on the right. Beyond the Seine, where from 100 sites the Germans launched their flying bombs and brought death and destruction on the English towns, our valiant armies went about the task long since assigned them. Toward the Reich frontiers, Americans advanced. Against the ports hugging the Channel, garrisoned in force by desperate foes, Canadians were sent. And in a thunderous sweep, the British armor surged toward a waiting Brussels.
The people of Brussels laughed and cried and threw flowers in the tank and said, "Goodbye, Tommy," when they meant to say hello. Man, they were happy. I suppose they were no longer afraid. But I remember wondering then how the first German civilians would react to us.
I remember one day we were coming across a big flat field. Didn't look like nothing special. I hopped a barbed wire fence and a guy says to me, guess what? So I says, what? So he says, you're in Germany. There's a sign over there says. Then like a dope, I thought, well, it won't be long now.
I won a quid over the fall of Paris and 10 bob on Brussels. And I had a fiver on it being over by October the 1st.
I remember the point system for getting out of the Army came out about this time. I began to think of that great chalk-striped double-breasted suit in the mothballs.
I was in the 7th Army coming up from the south of France. One day a lieutenant said, take a ride with me. I got some prisoners for you to guard. How many? I says. About 20,000, he said. A whole German division had surrendered.
We Canadians were advancing in the north. And one day we came across a thing I'd never seen before. I guess it's a flying bomb site, the officer says. Well, that really made me feel good.
The prisoner told us the newest Jerry gag. If an aircraft shows up white, it's American. If it shows up dark, it's British. And if it never shows up, it's the Luftwaffe.
Every time they sent me along to set up a forward switchboard and I got my earphones on, I found out that the rear switchboard had leapfrogged 5 miles ahead.
I wrote to the old man in St. Louis. He owns a men's store. I told him he better cut prices on GI neckties and socks if he didn't want to be stuck with a lot of military apparel.
Someone asked the Sergeant Major what he thought the chances were for a spot of leave. Don't you worry about leave, lads, he says. We've got the Japs to finish yet. Regular soldier, of course. Keen.
It was a terrific feeling crossing the German border. We were sure nothing could stop us.